to the second event in our current Hot of the Presses series, featuring Theaters of War, Contemporary Perspectives, which is an interdisciplinary anthology that came out just now, 2 months ago, I saw with Bloomsbury. So Hot of the Presses is not a hyperbole in this case. My name is Jeanette Kohl. I'm one of the 2 directors of UCR Center for Ideas in Society. And when I'm wearing my other hat, I'm an art historian working in the Italian Renaissance. And just very quickly, for those of you who might not be that familiar with the center, which has the honor of hosting this event, it's an interdisciplinary humanities center. And as such, we strive to support humanistic inquiry that explores new angles of research for the future, but also we're a platform. We really are understand ourselves as the window into our college for discussion of recent scholarly and creative work at UCR, and this is what this is. My welcome today comes from the office on campus, although I have a different background here, located on the traditional homelands of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. And we would like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to these caretakers of these lands and express our gratitude for having the opportunity of living and working here. So I've been asked to run a few housekeeping items by you for this 1 hour long event. The meeting will be recorded. So if you turn on your camera and unmute, there's a high chance that it will be recorded. We ask everyone, except for the speakers, of course, to please mute their microphones. There will, and you know the drill, there will be opportunities for you to ask questions at the end of the discussion, but also drop questions and comments for the panelists in the chat. We have closed captioning enabled, so you can activate it by, I think, going to the More menu and hitting the 3 dots on your Zoom screen control. So I'm really very happy and pleased to see this happening here at the center today. It's a fascinating and pressing set of questions. How do we make sense of war, if at all? Its insanities, the destruction, the grief, the terror, and of course, inevitably the chaos that comes with acts of warfare. How do war, cultural identities, and creativity relate to one another? And more specifically, in this case, why do so many writers and audiences turn to theater to resolve topics of pain and suffering related to war? So today's event presents to you a collection of essays that deal with these and related questions. I'm extending a very warm welcome from all of us to today's moderator, Laurie Shire. Laurie Shire is, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correct, the Xiaoxiang Scholars Program Distinguished Professor and Director of the British and American Poetry Research Center at Hunan Normal University in China. She's a specialist in contemporary arts and culture, in particular aesthetic form as political action. And she's the author of numerous books, among them a history of African American poetry with Cambridge University Press and the Heritage series of Black Poetry with Routledge. She's a frequent partner of the British Council and directed ancillary programming and international video conferences for several of their political theatrical productions, including The Great Game, Afghanistan, and Black Watch. She's greatly honored, so she writes, to have served as editor and contributor to Theaters of War, which features contributions by 3 brilliant UCR faculty members, Reza Aslan, Begoña Echeverria, and Annika Speer. And with that, I'm inviting Laurie to guide us through this afternoon hour on Theaters of War. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. My sincere thanks to the UCR Center for Ideas in Society, whose mission seems to be ideally aligned for this particular event, with special gratitude to Catherine Henshaw and Jeanette Kohl for their warm virtual hospitality and much appreciated efforts to plan and host today's book launch and panel discussion. Theaters of War, which was just published by Bloomsbury, was a project first conceived more than a decade ago. The central question, which Jeanette put so beautifully, was why and how theater has historically served as an effective medium to deal with the subject and impact of war, and what light our contemporary perspectives might shed. The resulting book examines plays about war across temporal and national boundaries and comprises 27 chapters by contributors from around the world who discussed more than 30 plays from a wide range of disciplines and methodologies, including the perspective of a decorated combat veteran and an international diplomat. Naively, when this project first began, as I wrote about in the book, I was worried that the topic was overly rooted in the political and cultural context of the first decade of the 21st century and might be dated by the time the book was finished and finally published. But ironically, the pandemic and its global impact, in conjunction with numerous tumultuous human rights and political developments in recent years, have made this book, we think, more current and needed than ever. It's been my great honor and joy to collaborate with 3 esteemed UCR faculty members on this book, and I'll introduce them to you next. That will be followed by a discussion prompted by questions that I'm delighted to ask, and then we'll close with Q&A. Reza Aslan, an internationally acclaimed writer and scholar of religions, is a contributing editor of The Daily Beast. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, and the Pacific Council on International Policy, and I imagine many more activities. I read about him everywhere doing countless things. He serves on the board of directors of the Plowshares Fund, which gives grants for peace and security issues, Abraham's Vision, and Interfaith Faith Peace Organization, and Penn USA. His first book is No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, which has been translated into 13 languages and named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade. He's written numerous other books, How to Win a Cosmic War, is the editor of an anthology from Norton titled Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. He is the president and CEO of Aslan Media Incorporated, whose holdings include Boomgen Studios, a mini motion picture and media company focused entirely on entertainment about the greater Middle East and its diaspora communities. Born in Iran, he is now associate professor of creative writing at UCR. Begoña Echeverria is the daughter of Basque immigrants to Southern California. She's a native Basque speaker with a PhD in sociology and professor at UCR's Graduate School of Education. Her ethnographic work on Basque language schooling has appeared in academic journals in education, sociolinguistics, and anthropology. She also publishes work on gender, identity, and language use in Basque songs, biblical texts, and folk tales. So the cross sections between our contributors are really fascinating. Her creative works include the historical novel, The Hammer of Witches, loosely based on the 1610 burning of Basque witches from the Baztan Valley, in northern Spain, from which her family hails. Published by the University of Nevada Center for Basque Studies, the novel was the Historical Novel Society's Editor's Choice in 2015. She's also a singer-songwriter with the Basque American Trio. Dr. Annika Speer is professor of teaching in the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production at UCR, where she runs the Public Speaking program. She's the co-director of the Public Speaking Initiative, a UC-wide program based out of UCSB that prioritizes interdisciplinary training in speech, rhetoric, and storytelling. She prioritizes communication pedagogy through close work with numerous campus programs, providing a large variety of public speaking workshops for the Graduate Student Resource Center, the Chancellor Research Fellows, the Science to Policy Certification Program, and the Social Entrepreneurship Engagement and Development Lab, to name a few. So let's get started with questions and I'll begin with Annika and Begoña. Since your contribution to the book and the play that you discuss was a collaborative undertaking, I'd like to leave it to the two of you to decide how you would like to answer the questions. So I'll address my questions to both of you with no disrespect intended to either of your individuality. You referred to the play Picasso Presents Gernika as a docudrama, combining elements of history, multimedia, present-day after effects of history, and a strong motive to teach. Could you please explain why docudrama struck you as the right form for this play to achieve your desired goals?
Thank you for that question. I'll go ahead and start as the playwright. Picasso presents Gernika, and the Gernika is the pronunciation and spelling of the town that was bombed by Hitler's troops with the permission of Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War, and it discusses the not only the bombing itself but its after effects. So after the bombing of the town of Gernika, it was the first aerial bombing that decimated a civilian target, and people understandably freaked out and sent their kids away because they didn't know what was going to be happening. So the play both traces their history, so Picasso is the narrator, but also the making of Picasso's artistic response, Gernika. And it was inspired by a true event. So when I was living in the Basque Country 30 years ago, I had a neighbor who was British, and her father and his brother were two of the children sent away to England. Some time passed, and the mother asked for the brother back, but not my friend's father. So the father passed away decades later, not knowing why his mother made the choice that she made. And that's all I know of that story. And then decades passed, and it just felt like a play to me. And I knew there was a lot of rich documentary evidence. And so I thought it would be a good way of telling the story would be not only the Picasso narrating these two stories of the children being evacuated in the painting, but also the historical artifacts. And I'll turn it over to Annika in terms of how we use those artifacts.
Yeah, so one of the things that docudrama does that's unique from documentary, I mean, I think most people are familiar with documentary, right? Which is entirely primary source material or trafficking in the real. Docudrama weaves imaginative fiction with primary source material. So it is uniquely situated to do exactly what Begoña was doing, which is, interpret a real event and take creative license with it. So it's immensely useful for voices that aren't captured on the public record, the voices of women and children, people of color, LGBTQ people, right? Whose voice gets heard and how is that voice documented? So I'm a documentary scholar in that I like to engage with the communication artifacts that we have that are historical, but also I think most documentary scholars are interested in troubling the document in the first place. So this play does that. It tells us the true story of this event and also imagines the circumstances of the lived experience of that event.
Fantastic, thank you. Let me turn to Reza. I've got a lot of follow-up questions. I'm sure we'll just keep weaving back and forth. Reza, the context of your chapter in the book is The Great Game Afghanistan, which is a cycle of 12 short plays that map the 150 plus years history of foreign involvement in Afghanistan. And you open by citing Edmund Burke's words from 2 centuries ago, which you build on to foreground that tension between nationalism and globalization. I would love it if you could please discuss any of the ways that you see this theatrical experience playing out that mismatch of models that you articulate so beautifully regarding the sense of Afghan identity.
Well, I mean, I think it starts there with that phrase, Afghan identity. What does that actually mean to Afghans themselves? And I should say that, obviously over the last 20 years in this attempt to quote unquote nation build in Afghanistan, that there has been a genuine concerted effort by Afghans, primarily more urbanized and educated Afghans, to construct something along the lines of a national identity that encompasses all the different ethnicities in Afghanistan. But the truth of the matter is that that national identity is it's sort of constructed by outsiders, right? What we now recognize as the national borders of Afghanistan are arbitrary borders. And the national identity is a fabricated national identity as part of, as you mentioned, the great game and the sort of parceling out and divvying up, you know, the lands of the greater Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, etc. But I mean, if you talk to Afghans themselves, they are far more likely to identify themselves by their ethnic identity than by any kind of national identity. In fact, the Afghan constitution, I believe, recognizes 14 ethnic identities. There are obviously the Pashtun and the Tajiks and the Hazara, the Uzbeks, the Baluchs. There are Arabs in Afghanistan. There are Persians in Afghanistan. And for them, you know, when it comes to the sort of construction of their self-identity, or even, you know, when it comes to in terms of their collective identity, the way that they sort of understand themselves as part of a collective, they may have a kind of a foggy notion of a national identity. And again, particularly because it was sort of an integral part of our attempts at, you know, reconstructing Afghanistan post the war in 2001, the launch of the war in 2001. But the truth of the matter is that they are far more likely to identify themselves by these very closely knit ethnic identities than they are national identities. And so the question then becomes, how do you construct this larger national identity, something that can be stable, something that is weighted by a strong centralized government in Kabul, for which most Afghans don't have any connection to, let alone any kind of loyalty to. And this is a problem that I think many empires have dealt with when it comes to their involvement in Afghan affairs. I think, you know, certainly right now, obviously, a lot of us are focused on the rise of the Taliban again and the sort of re-Talibanization of Afghanistan. But we can't really have that conversation without talking about the ethnic reasons for the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban are an ethnic community that represent the largest ethnic community in Afghanistan. And so they are, over and above, you know, the religious issues and all of that stuff, they have a very easy time, I think, communicating to their fellow Pashtun in terms that are appealing and that sort of naturally draw them in. So you may not agree with, you know, the Taliban's religious ideologies, their kind of puritanical interpretation of Islam, but you, as an Afghan, could have more in common with the Taliban because of your ethnic identity than you would have with you know, anyone running the central government or any of the other ethnicities there. So, you know, this is kind of the larger problem that I think the United States never really bothered to address. And then certainly the chaotic withdrawal of Afghanistan has only made the problem that much more, I think, of an issue. And we're certainly seeing the consequences of that right now in the devastating humanitarian crisis that's taking place in that country.
It's incredibly illuminating. The complexities are really mind-boggling. Thank you. Wow. Well, that's depressing.
Well, it begs the question. I'm sorry to continue.
No.
I will say it begs the question that, you know, so it's a fabricated nation with arbitrary borders drawn primarily to divvy up spoils amongst, you know, Western empires. So then the question, you know, I think, and it's a controversial question, by the way, by no means do I even know the answer to this question. The question then becomes, you know, is the nation state the proper way of thinking about, you know, how Afghanistan can survive and thrive? You know, are there other ways, confederations or whatever the case may be, that might be a better way of thinking about it? I think all of us here know this, but I think the vast majority of people think that the nation state was invented by God, you know, at the beginning of time, wasn't it? You know, it's like, this is an idea that's, you know, a little more than a century old.
Exactly.
Right?
That's why I love you beginning with Burke. And it is complex. You bring up the idea of any kind of stability. And we're all, of course, concerned with women's rights, women's education, women's safety. And how does something like that get generated in a way that is appropriate to the region and that can last and that's not externally imposed. And I love the fact that your contribution to the book is really speculative. You know, you don't give a prescription at all. You know, you just raise the complexities of the issue. And I appreciate that tremendously. I'd like to raise the question of time, which I think infuses all three of your work. Annika and Begoña, your work together really insists on returning to the past to show its continuing impact on the present. And as Begoña mentioned, that idea of the play didn't emerge until 20 years after its initial inspiration. So I see the past lingering in the present as a really insistent theme in this play and in your work together. It even applies to the title of the play and your discussion of the multiple meanings of present. So with our focus today on ideas and society, I would love it if you'd please discuss any ways that you see the genre of theater as having special capabilities of bringing the past into the present in a meaningful way for both the playwrights, people staging, and audiences.
Annika, did you want to start with this one?
Well, I was going to say, go ahead, because if you want to talk about the time lag and like hearing the story and developing the story, and then I can talk about theater a little bit.
Sure. As I mentioned, so I heard the story, well, now almost 30 years ago, and then it sat in my brain for my subconscious for a couple of decades. What was interesting, I'm not sure why the story presented itself to me as a play when it did. I can't point to a time where there was something happening historically or something happening that day that reminded me of it. But what was really interesting, but also very sad, was how resonant everything was when I wrote it, and even more so now. So not to give too much away, but so in the original story, it's two brothers that were sent away, and only one gets sent back home. And in what I decided right away was that it was going to be a daughter and a son, and I made that choice because I wanted to make an argument about the gendered effects of war. There are historical documents, including laws, that date from the very short-lived Second Republic in Spain from 1931 to 1936 that are pro women's rights, pro women's education, divorce laws, free public education. So it's not just related to, the Catholic Church being the only place to get educated. And at the very end of the play, there is a reading of all the ways in which all of those advances for women and girls were taken away under the dictatorship, which lasted from 1939 to 1975, right? So which I think a lot of people don't realize, it's a very long time for a dictatorship to last. And he was a friend of Hitler's, and people don't really know about him in the same way, or certainly don't vilify him in the same way. So one of the things that was sort of a sadness for me, I mean, it was interesting about how little I knew about my own family's history, even though my family is from the mountains and not from the coast where that was bombed. But I knew hardly anything about the history, really, but also how it's still timely. It's not, we haven't learned the lessons of history in terms of the difference that certain regimes make for women's rights or for refugees. And there's a lot of themes about the displacements of refugees that we continue to see. And part of me perhaps I like going to plays. I thought that I mean, it's very well documented, and still I did not know. And I felt that a play, especially one that is as visual as it's become, is a better way to tell that story. And I didn't want to be too preachy, but I had hoped through the audiovisual materials and archival materials that the audience members would take away different lessons about how the timely the themes continue to be. So I'll turn that over to Annika, see what she wants to do with that.
I mean, I agree with that. When Begoña wrote the play and came to me and said, I wrote a play, help me. I'm not a theater person, help me. This wasn't my history and it wasn't my story, but I was reading it and I just thought, wow, this is so salient to our current moment with what is happening on our border. We're constantly texting each other every time we see something in the news. I was struck by the image of the Afghan woman handing her child over the fence, right, to the US soldiers. That like stayed with me and immediately connected to the show as well. So there is, unfortunately, a timelessness to this story and our relationship with this story and the ongoing relationship with this story. And then I don't know that this answers the question of time so much as the power of theater. I think that storytelling is a timeless mode of meaning making and healing and narrative, right? The term thespian, if you go back in Western culture, a storyteller comes from Thespis. He was the first person in ancient Greece to stand on stage and began orating. And that's where we get the term for theater person, right? Goes all the way back there. So thinking about the power that this had for our students, because we were creating a new work, I guess this is a time/process answer, because the work was kind of constantly in motion, figuring out what we were doing and who our audience was and how we were speaking to that audience. It was really a joy to center students in the process, overseeing a team of 6 undergrads who were learning about the process of theater making and dramaturgical research, collecting all of this archival material and how you then choose to construct, in theater, there's editing, selectivity, arrangement. Well, I guess in anything, in any form of writing or narrative, there's editing, selectivity, arrangement, all of that. So how are we retelling this and what are we envisioning as timely to our current moment? So Begoña, we staged this in May of 2019, and then we just restaged it in November 2021 in Santa Monica. So we used a lot of the same visual material, but we also were adding new stuff. It was like, here's a way in which we can make a different decision for this current moment, for this current audience. So timing is also part of the storytelling process too.
Beautiful, beautiful. And that links back to that original question about why docudrama. It does allow the past to continue to exist in the present, but also to evolve. It doesn't tack it down to one present moment. It's a series of presents.
If I could add, sorry.
Of course.
I think the one thing that it really has been really wonderful for me to see. I mean, I'm a words person. We all are. I write a lot, but I think what the docudrama form seems to do better is to get to people's hearts. Yeah. So I mean, you can read the laws, you can look at, oh, these horrible things are happening again, and oh, too bad. But it's just watching it in both the live performance alongside the audiovisual materials, songs and images. It's really getting to people's feelings. And I think that's when we touch people's hearts and minds that I think we can maybe make more change.
I think that's so much of the uniqueness of theater. Reza, I also wanted to ask you about the question of time, because as I mentioned, your essay was originally written more than 10 years ago. You revisited it, you reflected on it, you updated it a bit. So that's a bit of a unique situation. Begoña and Annika wrote their essay quite recently, but yours has a provenance. And I was wondering if you could reflect on the situation in Afghanistan, maybe your frame of mind 10 years ago, 10 plus years, when you were first writing that essay, and then how you feel looking back on what you wrote today.
Oh, do I have to?
Well, you don't have to know, but I mean, and to broaden it, to take it out of the personal, if you'd rather, just, sort of what's changed in Afghanistan, what hasn't changed, what might we have learned from the great game Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to in any way say that I kind of envisioned, the 48-hour retaking of the entire country by the Taliban. I don't think anyone could have guessed that that was going to happen, although everyone knew that the Taliban would take over the second that the United States moved. But I guess, you know, the difference between 10 years ago and today is that, you know, there was reason to think 10 years ago that given time and space, that there would be a way to construct some kind of overarching identity, you know, again, and not sort of what we would consider to be a centralized nation state that, you know, has a monopoly over sort of, you know, the way in which the Afghan people themselves identify themselves, but, you know, a loosely confederated you know, government in which you had, you know, semi-independent provinces that would then feed revenue into the central government in Kabul and then kind of disperse it back out in the form of services, which isn't a lot, I think, to ask. I think that now, perhaps if I look back 10 years ago, I think that even then maybe we were a little bit too optimistic, that, you know, we were unaware of the fault lines that were so present in outside of Kabul, right? Because so much of our experience of Afghanistan, so much of the information that we receive from Afghanistan, Western journalists who reported from Afghanistan, certainly our politicians, were really focused on what was happening in Kabul. And now we know that, you know, what was happening in Kabul was having very little effect anywhere else in Kandahar or you know, Herat or anywhere else in Afghanistan. So, you know, I'm not going to say that I was sort of prescient in the way that I thought that, you know, things were going to turn out, but I think anyone who has studied Afghanistan knew that the way in which we were trying to build that nation wasn't going to work, and that the minute that we sort of left the country, that the process whereby the Taliban would regain control was going to start. But again, I don't think anyone envisioned that it would happen in such a short amount of time.
And yet it's also, you used the word prescient, and that's actually the word that I used for your chapter, your essay. It really, you could have read that and thought, maybe it's not quite so simple.
Yeah, but you know, I guess what I'd like to say about that is that I don't deserve any kind of sort of praise for that. I mean, anyone who had spent, you know, even a moment's time understanding the history of Afghanistan could have told you that this is how it was going to end. I mean, in October of 2001, I was writing articles saying this is how it's going to end. Yeah. But that's, you know, that's not impressive.
No, Nicole, who's, you know, a contributor to our book, said it has been like watching a train wreck, and you saw the train and you saw that it wasn't going to stop at the intersection, and there was very little that you could do to derail it.
Yeah, I think
that's the right way to think about it. With some, I apologize, Reza. The time is going so quickly, and we could, this is, I hope, the beginning of many more long and detailed discussions. It would be remiss of me not to note that all three of you have a creative practice as well as a profound commitment to teaching and to scholarship. And I would really appreciate it if each of the three of you could comment on how those three roles work together for you and how they reflect on your sense of your mission or professional identity, or even your personal identity.
Reza, you want to go first?
Me first?
Oh, or I can, but I saw you unmuted at the same time, so.
Well, so I think Annika said it really nicely. You know, I think we in the modern world think of stories as entertainment, and they are not entertainment. Stories are how we construct our very sense of self. Stories are how we understand who we are. and where we fit in the universe. Religion is storytelling. Politics is storytelling. Nationality is storytelling. Nationality is the story that we've all sort of agreed upon. And so, I think of myself first and foremost as a storyteller. And I just happen to work in various media, sometimes I write books, sometimes I work in, I produce television shows, sometimes I write screenplays or do podcasts, and sometimes I do it, through academia, but it's all just different forms of storytelling. And I think that the power of story is precisely its ability to break through those various markers of identity, right? Because stories are fundamentally about the human condition. They have a way of transgressing sort of nationality or ethnicity or religion or race or gender or sexual orientation. And so for me, regardless of what it is that I'm trying to communicate, whether it is some sort of complex academic idea about globalization's assault on national identity, or whether it's just a story about someone dealing with the realities of a war gone awry, I use storytelling in order to communicate, because it's the most effective form of communication that human beings have.
How does that relate to what you want to transmit to your students? Because all three of you are very clearly very dedicated to ideas of pedagogy and didacticism and the student experience. It infuses everything I read about all three of you.
Well, I guess, the short version of it would be that I make sure that my students understand, first and foremost, that people aren't interested in information. They're interested in stories. And so if you want to communicate information, you have to figure out a way to wrap it into a story. And then secondly, what we always talk about in my classroom is that stories are about people, not about events. I think oftentimes, people, when you say story to someone, their first question is, what is it about? And I try to train my students to stop asking that question, because it's a useless question. Who cares what it's about? The question is, who is it about? And then, the what, that'll eventually come. But so that's kind of, that's a huge part of my pedagogy, whether I'm teaching, religion or writing.
Thank you. And just on that note, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Tyron Thompson has joined the audience. Tyron, when were you at Cal State LA? When did you graduate?
2012. I graduated in 2012.
Okay, so Tyron is a former student of mine, a treasured student of mine. I still have some of your projects in my office, by the way. So I'm really honored to have this event that is so focused on what it is we're passing along, and to have one of my own students who's joined us. I really wanted to acknowledge his being here.
Thank you.
Begoña, what about you?
Well, it's interesting that you should say passed on, because I think for me, it's been passed on to me through my culture. It has been passed on through song. So that's really, my father was a big singer. His mother, who I never met, couldn't read or write, but she apparently knew hundreds of songs that she would sing with her 7 children as she went through her day with all her extra time. So I grew up with Basque song, which is how I know a lot about the culture. I grew up speaking the language. And yet when I became an academic, I kind of kept it. We'll keep this amongst ourselves. I kept that part of my life secret. I've been singing for the group for 25 years, and I started writing my novel, 15 years ago. And it was all related to my research. So sort of the same sources that I used for my scholarship, in the archives. Some of those sources were religious texts, or were folk tales, or were folk songs. And so they, in a way, they sort of naturally led to, or organically led to, my creative projects. But it wasn't really until I got tenure that I gave myself permission to kind of show everybody I'm doing all of this. Sort of, I felt like the part that matters is in what's in my head, not the other parts of me. So so now I try to encourage my students, even if we don't have an opportunity in class per se, to listen to those parts of themselves that are not just in their head, so that if there is a way that they feel that they can express their knowledge better in some other form. So sometimes I'll joke, if you want to, explain this concept through interpretive dance, that's fine. And I one time had someone do that. So that was, 10 years ago. And I still remember the dance that she did to illustrate a concept. So I think that I have just felt more free lately to share with my students the other things that I do, in case that there are other non-academic things that my students do that they will not be afraid of sharing and using as a way of telling their own stories.
Was it did you feel that your credibility somehow as a scholar would be diminished? What was your fear?
I think part of it was that, I'm in a school of education. I'm not in a theater department. I'm not in a creative department. And so I felt that, I have been able to make the case since, but I sort of felt like part of it was, yes, I should be focusing on scholarship and, articles with this kind of impact factor. But I also feel, I'm realizing now as I talk to you that it was sort of personal and private in mine. And I don't know that I wanted it to be displayed for my colleagues to judge until I felt like it was, okay, yeah, I think it's good. I'm going to say that it's good. And so, like it or not, I think it's good. And that's good enough for me.
It's a touching and tender story. I have two other questions. One, do you think that there's something about any kind of changes in academic environment that have made you feel more comfortable now than possibly in the past to share that creative aspect of yourself?
It's called getting tenure.
Well, yeah.
So once I got tenure, right? So when I got tenure, so I was doing singing, songwriting. I was doing for decades before, and I was writing, fiction. I hadn't published it yet, but so. But I made my tenure case based on, scholarship. So I kind of felt like, okay, I've shown my scholarly creds. And then it just so happened that the creative stuff, the historical novel, and certainly the play and some of the other songs and performances came afterwards, which a lot of them flowed from the scholarship. But I sort of felt like, well, it is all related. I mean, it's not like they're unrelated things. They're all of a whole to me. And so but really, honestly, it was the institutional backing of, I have tenure now. So, you're giving me an intellectual, license, and this is what it is for me. And I think it's what my contributions are in these different avenues. And really with Annika, it's been a really productive collaboration. If it weren't for her and some other colleagues, my play would be sitting in my drawer, probably on the desk that I'm sitting at right now. And so it's sort of, at this point, I've been sort of pay attention to the colleagues that sort of are seeming to move in the same direction as I'm going, even if I'm not sure what that direction is, but it feels positive.
And that's where community and collaboration that we get in the academic universe are so beneficial. And Annika, what about you? How do those roles come together for you?
For me, they are deeply mutually constitutive. A lot of what Reza was saying about teaching from the place of the storyteller, right? I think I envision, creative praxis is research and research is creative praxis, right? Those things are bidirectional in my opinion. And I think of my work as an academic as like a stool with 3 legs, and the stool falls, it's framed through e-file or through tenure as research, teaching, and service, but we can frame it as, research, creative activity, pedagogy, and service, which are all tied together. So much of my teaching work is running the public speaking program, which is an opportunity to, this is a requirement for a lot of STEM, pharmacy, dentistry, nursing, and in many cases, it's the only embodied performance class that they are going to take. So I see this as an opportunity to introduce students to the notion that speech is a political act, to empower them to think of themselves as storytellers and, to be ready for civic engagement and disruption, also teaching them how to disobey and think critically. So storytelling is critical thinking. And we do that through watching and learning from a variety of types of storytellers and listening to a diverse range of voices. So the power of the syllabus, right? Of whose voices and stories are we teaching, I think is incredibly important. Dylan just had his, you just went from camera off to camera on, but when your camera was off, right, we need a Black Studies department at UCL, right? Like whose voices are, I mean, I think we're all on the same page here, but like there is a dearth of space. Thank you. Well, I want to see your face too, but like the argument for this, right, is like give space, give institutional support to these ideas, these viewpoints, these voices. And we have an opportunity to do that as educators and artists, and to embed that in our creative work, our pedagogy, our epistemology, our service work, all of it. So they are, I can't wait till I get tenure, because this, as a theater person, I have to be able to justify what I do now, you know, before tenure. These things are deeply dovetailed for me.
It's a very moving example for your fortunate students to see that you're not conflicted. None of the three of you are divided, or at this point, post-tenure, apologetic about having all of these facets that are mutually constitutive, multiply constitutive, that all come together. Well, this is our opportunity to open it up to Q&A. Oh, Jeanette has a quick comment and a question that she'd like to address to everyone. So maybe that's a perfect way to slide into our Q&A.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do.
Great.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. I learned a lot. You know, I come from an academic culture where creative writing, theater are not part of any university. So that's a completely separate type of academy that we're talking about. So I'm really learning a lot here. I just wanted to share something probably very pedestrian, coming back to stories and stories of war, and it comes with a question. So I grew up in Germany. And when I was a small kid in the late 1960s, those stories of the war were everywhere, because the war had been barely over for 20 years. And one of the most impactful, I had a very close relation with my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, and she would tell all those stories about how my dad was a little kid, and then the British bombers came, and it was his birthday, it's his 6th birthday, and she had a cake in the oven, and they all had to run downstairs. And in the meantime, the cake burned up, and they came back to a completely charred piece of birthday cake upstairs. And I grew up with a lot of these stories, and I like to think now that when I'm looking back, that they were probably the most formative experiences that took me into a world as a kid that I could barely imagine. These were really powerful, powerful images that I still have in my mind and carry around with me. But interestingly, in post-war Germany, the war was barely thematized in theater or in cinema. So it was kind of swept under the rug, and there was a big, need for very positive, kind of cheerful entertainment stuff. But that leads me to the question of, that's addressed in so many ways in your fabulous book, about what predestines theater over cinema, for example, as a medium to reflect, to present those stories, to get the fear and the pity and the things that you want in an Aristotelian sense from your audience. So maybe one of you could talk a little about that difference. Is it just the immediacy of an experience of being close to a stage? What makes theater a particularly apt medium for war stories? Or is this a stupid question?
It's a great question. I think we're all, we'd all like to dive in. I'd be happy to take it. Is there anybody that would like to dive in?
Yeah, I'll just briefly think aloud for a second on it. I mean, obviously, cinema or film reaches a wider audience. There's benefit, there's, pluses and minuses, there's different mediums, but of course, the embodied human being in the room, the beating heart, the live presence. I talk about this in public speaking, like the audience doesn't just want the message, they also want the messenger. So in the age of technology and infoglut, why do we go to a conference instead of just reading the article? Why go to a concert instead of just listening to Spotify? Why go to class instead of just reading the textbook, right? We want that there is a humanistic community building aspect to being in the room where it happened, and aliveness that is irreplaceable. And that is what theater and embodied performance, we can use different terms for this, offers. And there's a power to that intimacy, and connectedly to the individual narrative, right? We know we can't individualize our way out of a systemic problem. And also there is immense empathy building, I think, that happens when we read the Diary of Anne Frank over the Wikipedia page about the Holocaust or whatever. Just the intimacy and the power of the live body and the personalized narrative is, I don't care how much we invent technology, we're married to our screens, and yet we still want and need that. So that's my crack, I guess, at that answer.
Yeah. Two chapters in this book came to mind, Jeanette, as you were talking. One is by Anna Rindfleisch, who wrote about performances of Shakespeare, both live performances and cinematic performances in Nazi Germany. And I think you'd find that extremely interesting. So she plays off cinema and live performance in that specific political context. And then Kevin Reardon has an essay about Afghan in Singapore, and a recreation cinematically of what was originally a story, and then became a play, and then became a film, and then became a rewritten play. Sort of this series of iterations, and that's also quite an interesting essay. And my feeling, based on both of these, is I think that the indeterminacy of the audience role is one of the most exciting experiences that we have, that I think is quite unique to theater. We don't always know it's being called on us, called on for us as members of an audience. We are clearly participants in a creative process in some unpredictable way. We're both individuals, we're going deeply within ourselves, and yet we're part of a community. And I think that I completely agree with what Annika is saying about the creation of empathy, that sense of immediacy. But there's something very stimulating about being in a group and not knowing how we're going to respond to something unfolding in real time, that I think is a lot of theater's power. So shall we open it up? We have another couple of minutes, please. Questions to others. Jenna, those are great questions. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for Reza Aslan. Can you comment on connection between your work on zealots and Afghanistan?
Could you be a little bit more, is there something that you were thinking about? Like, is there a particular?
Well, would you consider the Taliban as zealots?
Oh, well, I do think that it's important to note that Zealot, my biography on Jesus, refers to a very specific movement in the first century called zealotry. And, obviously that has, it's related to, the word itself, but, it's talking about a very, very particular socio-political movement in the first century of Jews who wanted to throw off Roman occupation and sort of rededicate the Holy Land to as kind of the rebuilding of the kingdom of David, if you will. But insofar as the use of religion as a political force, the use of religion as a means of creating a kind of umbrella identity in order to affect political change. Yeah, I think that there's some very interesting parallels between Afghanistan and first century Palestine. But I also think that that's not all that unusual, right? Religion has always had the most currency with the masses. Religion, I think, allows for the communication of very complex ideas, particularly in the political realm, in very simplistic terms, right? I mean, we talked about 20 years ago in the launch of the war in Afghanistan. Let's not forget how that war was launched. It was launched as a crusade against evildoers. And, you know, there may have been a lot of conversations about whether this is the proper way of responding to the attacks of 9/11, whether, what would be the political ramifications of this war and the destabilization of the Middle East. But, a war between good and evil is pretty easy, I think, for most people to understand. And, that kind of religious language has always had the ability, I think, to rally people to causes that are far more complex than the kind of patina of religion allows for.
Is there one more question? I think we've got time for a final question. This is your opportunity. Amazing speakers here.
I have a question, if I may.
Great.
I'd be interested to turn the question back to you, Lori, and ask how these two chapters that we've heard about here today, fascinating conversation, by the way, I know we could talk for a long time, but they overlap and they diverge in really interesting ways. So I'm thinking about your book project as a whole and thinking about the chapters as a kind of a constellation that might also have a bit of a narrative or an arc. So could you sketch for us or give us a sense of how these two chapters interact with the other essays or pieces in the book as a whole?
Yes, gladly. I mean, we go back to classical Greek theater, and then we come up to tribunal theater that was being produced as of when the book went to print in 2020, late 2020. So it covers an immense gamut. And I think what's striking is the similarities. It covers a wide range of nationalities, a wide range of types of playwrights, very different identities, coming from very different political places. And to see how war's futility is and war's destruction. And I particularly appreciated the way you framed this event, or the description of the book in the kind of invitation, where you said who is disproportionately affected. And that's been, an undercurrent here that I would love to bring to the surface. It is often people who, it is women, it is children, it is non-combatants, it is societies as a whole with generations of lasting impact. Jeanette was talking about ramifications of German politics, even in her own childhood. So I would say that is something that keeps coming back. People have experienced this book as hopeful and optimistic, and that has really meant a lot to me, because it's a pretty heavy-duty subject. We're talking about the most destructive human acts that we can imagine, and typically it's politicians using people to achieve political ends. And that's who suffers. So I would say that this is sort of the common link among these two chapters and among the widely diverse chapters in the book as a whole. You read it and you think, theater is coming out and saying, look at what's happening. Look at what's been done. Look at what it's resulted in. Don't we have something better and more noble as humanity to achieve? So I want to thank our host so much for welcoming us here. Shall I turn it back to Jeanette to provide us closure? And thank you all. Thank you, Reza and Begoña and Annika, Catherine, Jeanette, for all of you for being here. It means a lot to us that we can share our message with you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Lori, for a fabulous afternoon lesson and fabulous stories, and for chiming in from China, I assume.
I'm actually in Los Angeles right now, but
right, You're closer than I thought.
But I will be going to China very shortly with a little bit of trepidation, but I'll be going in January.
Well, then, safe travels, and a lovely afternoon to everyone else in the Zoom room. And it was lovely to listen and great to listen to your stories and learn more about the contributions, and hopefully see you back at the center soon. Thank you.
Thank
And
you
good
for
luck
having
with the
us.
Black Studies department.
Yay.